had the sharp sickle, saying, Thrust in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. It's a second harvest. And the angel thrust in his sickle to the earth and gathered the vine of the earth and cast it in the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden without the city, or outside of the city, and the blood came out of the winepress, even to the horses' bridles, to a space of 1,600 furlongs. 1,600 furlongs. So, we don't use furlongs anymore. Does anybody have a furlong calculator in their head? 8 furlongs is a mile. So if you're thinking of track, how many times around a track? Is it 4 times around a track is a mile? Isn't that right, Sean? 4 times around is a mile. So 2 furlongs. It'd be like a 2 furlong loop. So 8 furlongs is a mile. That means 200 miles. So here's what we've got. We have blood to the horses' bridles, which is roughly 5 feet. 5 feet up, 200 miles wide. So if you were a data analyst and you were awake at 2 o'clock in the morning thinking about this, like I was, you'd end up pulling out your iPhone and you would try to figure out how much blood that was. So here's what I learned. I'm thinking, how can you measure a 200-mile wide pool of blood? So I thought, well, you always eat an elephant by taking it one chunk at a time. So I looked up cattle troughs. I'm from Kansas. We have cattle. A cattle trough, 1 foot deep, is about 500 gallons. Oh, that works. 10 foot wide, foot deep, right? Start adding it up, pulling it through. You end up figuring out that, give or take, there's about 9.5 quarts or 9.5 pints of blood per individual. So you take that cattle trough and you make it a 200-mile wide cattle trough that happens to be 5 feet tall and fill it with blood. And then you divide it by 9.5 pints and you come up with, depending on, just the cattle trough itself would hold 236 million people's blood. And if you figure that it was that high, 5 feet wide for 200 miles, and then it starts to gradually taper down because that's what water does, right? It ends up, look at the ocean, right? It ends up tapering down to the shore sooner or later, right? You end up with roughly 436 million people that died in that one experience. So you have the first harvest that happens where we don't know what happened to the people, and I think it's because it's the rapture. Because it's the man on the cloud that did it. And that matches what Matthew 24 says. But then you have this second harvest that is a little bit more ambiguous, but we know what happens. Everybody that died in that one was thrown into the winepress of God's wrath, and they were destroyed in the winepress of God's wrath. And we know that it's somewhere between 236 and 420 million people that died in that experience. That's a lot of death. And it says that they were gathered, they were harvested from the earth, which means that it's going to be some massive global experience where by this point we're already severely depopulated because of all the things that have happened prior to this. And it looks to me like it's going to be about 1 out of every 3 or 1 out of every 4 people goes missing simultaneously all at once from the second harvest, and we don't know how many people go missing from the first. So you're going to have a lot of people that go missing all of a sudden. Anyway, thought you might like to know that. Kind of interesting. So this is, just to keep us in mind, we are still in the 7th trumpet. We have not yet gotten out. So if you remember, one of the scriptures that we read when we were talking about the rapture was at the last trump. Where are we at? The last trump. There are no more trumpets from this point on. This is the last one. Seems to kind of mix. Go back real quick in 14. Just a few things to point out. The third angel followed in verse 9, If any man worships the beast or his image and receives his mark, so what do we know? We know that humans are here still at this point. Not only that, we know that Christians are still here at this point, because here's the patience of the saints. Blessed are those who die in the Lord. So at the seventh trumpet, at least at the beginning of the seventh trumpet, there are still Christians on the face of the earth. And then we reach the end of this period, and then that's when we see the harvest happen. So let's keep going. Chapter 15. And I saw another sign of heaven, a great and marvelous sign, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath, the thumos of God, the hot breath of God. And I saw, as it were, a sea of glass mingled with fire, and them that had gotten the victory over the beast. Well, how did they get victory? They were on the sea of glass. Where would that be? We found out where that was earlier. Does anybody remember where the sea of glass is at? It's in front of the throne of God. Because John's explaining it. When he sees the throne, he sees this crystal, this ocean of glass that's in front of the throne. So all of these people who got victory over the beast are in the presence of God in heaven in front of his throne. They got victory over the beast and over his image and over his mark and over the number of his name. And they stood on the sea of glass having the harps of God. And they sing a song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are thy ways, King of saints. Who will not fear you, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy. For all nations shall come and worship before you, for your judgments are made manifest. And after that I looked, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened. So let's remember this now. The temple and tabernacle that we have on earth is just an image of what actually exists. What we have down here is just something that's a figment. It's a picture of what happened, what actually exists in heaven. And we see this in the book of Hebrews. The writer of Hebrews explains this to us. So there is a temple in heaven, we know that. There is an altar in heaven, we know that, because Jesus laid his own blood on the altar in heaven as he made atonement for mankind. And that's a really fun conversation at some point we should talk about. Wow. Anyways. I behold, verse 5, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony. So we've got of, right? The temple of the tabernacle of the testimony. So the testimony is talking about the ark. Down here we would have called it the Ark of the Covenant. In the Holy of Holies, remember me telling you about the 20 by 20 room that the priest would go in once per year, and they had bells on the bottom of his garment so that if he stopped jingling, they could pull him out with the rope that was tied to his ankle? The Holy of Holies, it was the mercy seat. 2 cherub angels with their wings stretched over it. There is in existence that element of worship in the heavens. And that's what we're reading about right here. The tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was open. So in other words, the holy place where God would sit. The 7 angels came out of the temple, having the 7 plagues, clothed in pure white linen, having their breasts girded with a golden girdle. And one of the 4 beasts that was walking around in front of the throne of God, one of the 4 beasts gave to the 7 angels 7 golden vials full of the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. The thumos of God, filled with the thumos of God. This is God's last attempt to try to get the attention of mankind. God's